Welcome to a stream from Street Chess, which is currently being run online here in Canberra while we're waiting for Canberra venues to reopen. And hopefully this will be the final stream from Street Chess covering the online events, because as of next Saturday, the 30th of October, we should be back at King O'Malley's from 11 a.m. on Saturday morning for Street Chess back in person. ACT venues are opening up on the 29th. Following day, Saturday, we'll be back there. Come along if you live in Canberra. Make sure you bring a mask. Even though we're outdoors, we might still have mask requirements in place. And I'm not sure about vaccine requirements, but given that most of Canberra is now vaccinated, double shot, just come along, make sure you bring some proof of that, just in case you need that to get into the venue. But I want to just focus on the final, hopefully, online Street Chess, which was played yesterday and was won by Hui Li, who is a regular winner of these online events and also a regular winner of Street Chess in person as well. And this was, in fact, his final round game to secure a victory. He scored 6.5 out of 7. He was a little bit lucky in the first round, where Matt Radicic had a winning ending but wasn't able to convert. But this is the final round. And Hui's style is a very solid, accurate style, is a really good way of describing it. Knows his tactics when he needs to play his tactics, but he's just content in nursing small advantages until they become big advantages. He's particularly good at endings, and I think if Canberra players want to get better at chess, 1, study your endings, 2, play Hui Li, and that will help you a little bit here. And it turns out this game was almost completely perfect. The Lichess analysis engine couldn't find any mistakes here for black, but it's still worth having a look at how he went in this game. So Hui Li is black, hence the board is upside down, and bishop here. So this is just a standard Queen's Gambit line. The Lasker defense, basically h6, and you can just take. Okay, which is the anti-Lasker line, apparently. Not that I know this too well. I tend to play Queen's Gambit accepteds rather than declines. And bishop takes. The slightly more complicated line, but it's still theory. Bishop back here, and then black tries to free the position by landing the knight on e4. It always is a little bit of a head scratcher for me when I was first starting to play chess to understand exactly what was going on after positions like this. Okay, but it turns out that black is fine here with the f5 move. And so this is, in a sense, why this line can be played for black. I mean, I'm paranoid about double pawns, but nonetheless it works. More likely, the bishop will swap first and takes, and then you can take on d5. And then knight takes c3 obviously has to be played in between. Pawn takes, e takes, bishop d3 is equal. Both sides will just complete development. White has probably a slight advantage in the centre, but black has no dramas in dealing with this one. And the other line after taking is just to simply play c6 and try and hold the centre like this. Instead, black took back, white exchanged, and there's a bit of a theme that will turn up in this game a few times, and that is white's quite keen to exchange pieces off, but it turns out that these exchanges tend to help black in a lot of instances. Queen b3 might be an interesting move here. It's a little bit disruptive because after c6 to protect the d pawn, there's always a little bit of pressure on the pawn on b7, and moves like queen to c7 to defend it tend to run into rook c1 with a pin down the c file. Instead, bishop e2, solid, c6, and we castle. Bishop f5 is a pretty good move in this position, just keeping an eye on the e4 square so that black doesn't run into issues with e4 being played. Queen here, and here is the first small mistake that the white played. White captured on b6, and at first, again, there are two explanations for this. One is, hey, I'm doubling my opponent's pawns, and 2, I don't want queen takes b3 to happen, because after queen takes b3, pawn takes, maybe the b pawns are a little bit weak. But it turns out that this exchange almost always favours the player who is recapturing and opening the h file, or in this case, the a file. And the rook is now putting pressure on the a pawn. At some point, to free the rook and the knight from the guard duties of the a2 pawn. White will play a3, and this actually gives black an opportunity to play moves like b5, b4 to open that file for the rooks. So he plays a3 straight away, and as I said, b5, b4 is always a little bit of a threat now. But for now, we'll just develop. I swear I've seen at least one Capablanca game where the bishop came back to d7 with the idea of playing on the queen side, but it probably wasn't this position because I think it's important the knight comes out. So rook to c file and b5 as before. Rook comes across. Here we go. So a few more moves getting to the position we want. Knight b6 is now black is looking at plunking that knight onto e4. C4. And after g5 and the bishop retreats, White offered the exchange here. I'm not sure that this is the right idea, but at the same time, I think White has decided they do probably need to play something like e4 in this position. And so removing the pieces defending the e4 square. But after we take here, the knight gets to c4. It's not going to be challenged by the bishop. And the knight's pressuring both the b pawn and the a pawn, because of course you can't play b3 or b4 to save the b pawn because you will drop the a pawn. So the rook came to c2, and black is slightly better in this position because black is the one making the threats. And that's always important to kind of understand in some positions. And as I said, this is typical of Hui Li's style, where he's just looking for good squares for his pieces. Those good squares happen to be in the opponent's half of the board, which always helps. G6 surprised me a little bit. I couldn't quite work out why this move was particularly good. But after knight back, king here, at least it's starting to get the king towards the center. Knight decided to eliminate that dangerous knight on c4. But after b takes here, black has still a small advantage, which he can turn into a bigger advantage with this plan of playing b5, bringing the rook over to the b file, and then playing b4. And the idea is that you force the swap of the a pawn for the b pawn. You capture with the rook, and then you double the rooks on the b file, putting the rook that's currently on a8 to b8. And then you put pressure on the b2 pawn, which doesn't have any other pawns to defend it. The drawback with this one is I think white has enough just to hang on in this position. And one of the risks of playing too positionally in positions like this is if you put all your eggs in the one basket, i.e. you focus on one target, your opponent normally can defend that. So at some point, the principle of two weaknesses comes into play, where black will actually create one weakness on the queen side and then find somewhere else. So the rook went to e2, again with the idea of potentially playing b4 at some point. The rook goes to e6, and this was a flexible move in that the rook on a8 can come across to e8 if needed to pressure down the center, and or still continue with the other plan. So the king went to g2. Now there's an interesting line that I had a quick look at, which was rook here with the idea of trying to force through e4 in this position. E4 didn't work straight away because the d pawn was hanging, so the rook needed to protect. So the bishop goes back here, and now the idea is to play something like bishop a5, bishop takes c3, and then the a pawn is not protected by the pawn on b2. So if we try e4 now, bishop here is the right move. Pin and win. Note that a move like b4 runs into the en passant capture here. So you can't sort of block that straight away. So, but if we take here, the line was take here, and then after the pawn took back, an exchange sacrifice happens. So you play knight takes here, bishop takes, rook takes. But it's still in favour of black in this position. White's kind of created a little bit of freedom. There is a threat of knight c7 in this position, which kind of gains a tempo, but ultimately black is better here. Instead, king came up towards the centre, and then rook h8 was a little bit another sort of shift in the position. So the rook goes to the h file. Black is going to play h5. As I said, it's about creating two weaknesses. Black decided not to pursue the plan of opening the queen side and is instead going to open the king side. Knight b8 was a little bit of a blunder. but it was only setting white up for a bigger mistake. So taking here and rook takes, and suddenly that H pawn is quite weak. For example, if you play knight c3, admitting that knight b1 probably wasn't your best move, rook check, king to h2, bishop back here, simply because after rook e1, because white doesn't actually have many moves in this position, especially with the king trapped. Say we play rook here, and then you've got this check, king goes back, and then you've got this sneaky rook e8 retreat. The idea is you're going to go to h8, and then you're going to try and win the h pawn. Knight d2 actually was worse, though, because it cut off the rooks from protecting each other. And as I said, black knows the tactics that need to be played when they need to be played. So bishop takes d4 just wins a pawn. Because, of course, if you take, then the rook goes because of the pin. White played knight f3, but instead can try knight takes c4, so what we call a desperado here. Instead of leaving the pawn to its fate, you sacrifice your knight because now the rooks are connected, and when the knight gets captured, the bishop gets captured now, because after rook takes rook, rook takes rook. But the drawback with this line is you still lose a pawn. So the rook goes to d6, and we can't keep protecting that pawn because after c5 in this position, the pawn's pinned, you can't take it because you lose the rook, but in a slightly instructive way. The argument is, oh, I take anyway, and if rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, and then rook returns and takes the pawn, and we've actually got 4 pawns each. But always look for intermediate checks. The rook firstly sails across here with check, attacking the king, and when the king moves to safety, you pick up the rook with your other rook, and this is just now winning. For black, a rook up. So back in this position here, it's best just to surrender the pawn, okay, rather than hang on to it. But instead, knight f3, and then the bishop retreated f6. Knight d4, okay, attacking the rook and the pawn. So again, it's one of these things where exchanges are actually helping black here, and black is happy to swap pieces off, because we will get to a pure king and pawn ending at some point soon. And that was one of the reasons I chose this game. I want to talk about that. Rook h4 to attack the d-pawn. You could just swap rooks again. Rook takes, rook h4, rook here, and then march your king up. But rook h4, rook takes, f takes actually helps black a little. Gives a path through the pawns for the king, but also it means that moves like e5 to remove the d4 pawn can be played here. We could play rook e2 to try and attack the pawn, but after king here, rook back to d2 to protect the pawn again. Now you don't want to give that pawn away for the rook because the rook becomes massively active. We play e5 here, and black is going to win this ending using both the rook and the king, because for white the main problem is this ending is lost as a king and pawn ending. So black can always play defensive moves that offer the exchange of rooks, knowing that they're going to get a winning position. Rook d2 straight away, rook e4 to grab the file, king up, rook down, rook back to offer the exchange of rooks, and now this is just winning for black. But it's still instructive on how to win, because there is at least one line where you can go horribly, horribly wrong. So king f6, pawn to f4, and king e7 was played, which was a good plan because, in fact, black isn't going to charge at the pawn's head on, but it's going to swing the king to d6 and then play c5, because the risk of charging head on is this. We go here and here, okay, and then suddenly it's black that needs to find a move in this position, and retreating the king allows the white king to get more active than it deserves to be. So if you try and play g5, for example, f takes, g takes, h4 is a nice move, especially if you take, which is dubious, because we get this kind of situation. Now, it turns out this is still winning for black, unless black plays a couple of lemons, but it's worth at least studying how these endings go. So at the moment, black is 2 pawns ahead, but the white king is going to try and come in and start capturing pawns. So king back, king across, and black, luckily enough, just has enough to to finish the game off. But I'll show you the terrible line as well. So here we go, chomp, chomp. And this looks obvious, and this unfortunately only leads to a draw. Because when we take here, that A pawn is suddenly running down the board. And it takes white too long to get the king around to take the B pawn and promote their own C pawn, or move the king out of the way and just start pushing the B pawn. The D pawn as well. So this is a situation where capturing something is wrong. Instead, you play king d3, and your target isn't the D pawn, your target is the B pawn, because after taking and taking A5, when you take here, your C pawn is a lot closer to queening. And the whole point, of course, of endings is to get your pawns to the end of the board. Now, chess engines will say that white is winning here, but these are horrible endings to play at the best of times. So even in this position where black is winning, this is unnecessarily difficult for black to win this ending. So I wouldn't even go here at all. And this is why king e7 turns out to be the right move. King comes up, we play here, king across, and then c5. And then the whole idea, of course, is that you're fixing your pawn structure, and at the same time you're now threatening to, after taking, you've got a passed d pawn coming down the board. h4, because it's a move. Okay, black can take here, because after this move here, king c6, king e5. Again, king d7, because you don't want to lose control of what's happening on the king side there. Those white pawns can become dangerous if they're allowed to get through. f5 is fine. G takes f5. And it looks like this pawn might be causing some issues, but the problem for white is that both the D and F pawns can become queens if the king moves in the wrong direction. And by moving in the direction, I mean going this way, because that you can't catch now. The H pawn's never going to queen because the king's guarding it, and the king is too slow to stop the D pawn running down the board. So this idea, most people know this trick, but if you've never seen this trick before, it's a good one to remember, that essentially if you've got pawns arranged like, hang on, if I get my, try again, pawns arranged like this, the black king can never capture that one because that one just runs. So instead, h4, b4 was a nice move here. And again, you're just threatening to start making queens. A little bit tricky. A takes b4, b takes, and again, you're back to that same position we had before, except even better for white. Black, sorry. The white king can't go too far away from the queen side because c3 is going to make a queen. And this also gives black the freedom just to be super annoying and start marching, the king in this direction, to clean up these pawns is necessary. One of the important points about king and pawn endings, just before we get to the end, of course, is you can take your time. You don't have to rush. Okay. So b4, a4 got played, b3, pawn takes, king went back to keep an eye on things because the threat, again, if the king goes too far away, is actually just to push this pawn so that when we capture, this pawn will come through. Okay, so king takes, king went back, pawn up just to stop the king coming to c3 to be annoying, a5, and then king b5. And black is just going to take this pawn and then just wander back into the queen side and convert by playing king to b4 and then c3. So that was a nice win for Weili. As black, it's fairly typical of his style. Just building up an advantage, heading for a favourable ending if you can get to a favourable ending. The advantage of playing endings like that, of course, is you generally do know what the result is going to be, so that there's no sort of concern over, does my opponent have any tricks? The less counterplay your opponent has, the easier it is for you to win the game if you've already started with an advantageous position. So thanks for tuning in. My name is Sean Press. I run Street Chess on Saturdays here in Canberra. As I said, for the last 3 months or so, we've been online while Canberra's been in lockdown, but Kalu Calais, that's finishing up later this week. And hopefully we'll be back at King O'Malley's on Saturday morning from 11 a.m. I am still running online events for the ACT Chess Association until the chess clubs go back. We'll probably run at least one of them up until the end of the year. So I'll probably be doing these video summaries of events up until Christmas time. So thanks for tuning in today, and hopefully I'll be seeing you later.